Je m'appelle Simon de GBF.
Member of ACBA, and I'm joining you from Kenya. Now, before we start, I would love to make a few announcements. Firstly, please ensure that you mute yourself if you are not speaking and only unmute once it's your time to speak at any given time when we give you the floor. Please note that we do have French translation for this session. In order to be able to access the translation, please go to the interpretation button, which should be in the menu that is at the bottom, and click either English or French, depending on which language you would prefer to follow the sessions on. Should it happen that while you are in translation, you can still hear the original audio from the speaker, please use still the interpretation button and mute the original audio. And we do invite you to make use of the chat box for any questions, comments as the discussion go on. And we will be able to address this at the relevant times, as we've put in quite a lot of time for questions. You are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat box so that we know who's here. You can put your name, the organization that you come from, and also the country that you come from. Now, colleagues, on why we are here, slightly a few years ago, after COP14 in Egypt, which now is very far, 2018, a process was started to negotiate the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It's been a lengthy one owing to the COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the very huge milestones that happened after a very long period of lockdowns was that there was OEWG-3 that was hosted in Geneva physically after close to 2 years of not being able to meet in person. To this effect, there've been quite a couple of developments. We can argue later whether sufficient or not in negotiating the framework. And OEWG-4 is going to be a very significant step before we get closer to the post-2020 framework that would hopefully take us closer to the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Now, before we add flesh to the skeleton and I introduce my speakers, I would love to invite Pauline Nantongo, who comes from EcoTrust Uganda and leads the policy work of the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance, which is the organization convening this webinar, for her to give us welcoming remarks and perhaps tell you a bit who is ACBA and what we do. Pauline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Smangele, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me. I hope you can hear me. It's a pleasure for me to be given this opportunity to welcome you on behalf of ACBA. And we are a civil society or Africa-based civil society biodiversity alliance. As a collective voice of African conservation scientists, civil society leaders, we came together in February 2020 to be able to find strategies of bringing the CSO voices around the CBD framework within the context of what this means for biodiversity, but also for the people that depend on it. So I'm really excited about this opportunity to be brought to speed on on where we are and what's going on, because one of the reasons as to why our voices weren't heard is because even as we weren't aware of what is happening the other side, and even when we participate, sometimes because we are geographically removed from these processes, we are not able to effectively participate because we don't have sufficient knowledge about what's going on. So I'm really excited about this opportunity where fellow African CSOs are able to bring to speed the rest of us who may not be as engaged. But even when some of us are engaged, we don't participate in everything. So an opportunity like this where different people that are bringing different perspectives to bring all of us up to speed is a very welcome opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pauline, and thanks for joining us from the Pearl of Africa. Now, colleagues, I'm going to jump straight to the agenda. I am joined by speakers who will be unpacking some issues for us. We have Innocent, who comes from WWF, who will be briefing us on what happened in Geneva, what didn't happen, and a few insights from him. We have Paul from Nature Kenya, who will give us updates on some of the developments when it comes to issues that touch Target 19 on resource mobilization. We have Letitia from South Africa, who will give you updates on issues that are speaking to digital sequence information. We have Pierre from Namibia, who will touch on issues that touch area-based conservation and sustainable use, as reflected in Target 3 and 5 respectively. And lastly, but not least, we're going to have Helena Paul from Econexus, who will also be giving us some updates on negotiations that have been happening around the issue of business engagement, which is on Target 15, as well as some of her reflections on what are the priorities that we need to look out for in the session that is coming in Nairobi. Now, Innocent, I would love to start with you to please give you your presentation of an overview of what was discussed in Geneva and what are some of the issues that are pending for Nairobi. Over to you, Innocent. You are muted.
Thank you very much. I have muted myself. I hope you can see and hear me now.
Yes, I can see and hear you. You may need to
put your
presentation in. Yeah, great.
Yes, so one to begin with, I think it is very difficult to summarize what took place in 3 weeks in just 10 minutes, but I'm going to try as much as possible because I believe that most of us already have a good grasp or at least an elementary understanding of what this framework looks like, even in the draft. And so so basically, I'm going to speak about what was on the agenda. And this is very well summarized based on the arrangement of work that was there for the workshop, and it's based on the scenario note that was issued by the co-chairs and the secretariat just before the meeting. And this work was organized around 5 main contact groups. These are the sessions that the contact groups are mainly these are the negotiation sessions that take place. So we had the first one, which looked at the goals. The goals of, as you know, there are 4 goals that pretty much underpin this draft framework as it is. I don't need to go into those details because there will be no time if I went into the details, but feel free to come back if we need to go back. And then in the overall structure of the framework, the contact group was also, as part of the agenda, to look at the background, the purpose of the framework, and the relationship between the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the 2030 Agenda, and of course, associated with it, the Sustainable Development Goals. The section D, which looks at the theory of change, trying to look at how all the pieces of the framework work together to achieve the change that we want. And then on section E, which talks about the 2050 vision, as well as the 2030 mission. And this is based on the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which was the basis for this meeting and its negotiations. The second contact group looks at a set of 8 targets classed and classified under what you may consider to be targets that address the reduction of threats to biodiversity. So they range from human-wildlife conflict to area-based conservation. And I think that these ones were also quite important. In fact, one of the most I would say, I don't want to say that there was differentiated attention, but this was perhaps one of the most interesting group of targets to be discussed during, for those of you who followed. We had another set of 5 targets that address meeting people's needs from biodiversity, and this is target 9 to 13. And then the target that looks at the tools and solutions for the implementation. They talk about things, outreach, communication, elements of mainstreaming, including the voices of women, IPLC, and what have you. And then finally, the digital sequence information, which is also quite an important area. I believe you'll get to see this as the rest of the colleagues who are going to present will come on. Now, in terms of the status, so what was discussed? And this I'm borrowing, in fact, from a summary of made by one of the co-chairs of the open-ended working group. We had a number of sections that underwent what you can consider to be a full cycle of first negotiation or first reading, and this is regards to the mission. Remember, there's a mission which is supposed to guide the parties in the implementation of the framework over the period of right now it's not very clear because we are in 2022. Initially, it was thought that this was going to be a 2020 to 2030 mission. So this is perhaps one of the areas that attention needs to be given, including by us as the Africa CSOs, and of course in consultation and putting heads together with the parties who are represented on this call and those that we speak to on our daily basis. We also had a focus on the 4 goals, all the 4 goals, as well as targets 1 up to 6. I think this one can be considered to have been fully negotiated. As usually what happens is when you have these negotiations, you've got what you may call like a first reading or a first cycle of negotiation, where all the parties get a chance to really negotiate and try to put all their views together so that in the negotiation format. And then there was also others that were not tabled and discussed, but I think that is considered to be partial because it was not complete. This includes the target 7, 8, 13, 20, and 21, in addition to a new target which was proposed that relates to the equitable and access to women and girls and their contribution to sustainable use and biodiversity conservation. The area of milestones was also not concluded on. In fact, right now, it is not known whether the milestones still exist or not, but I think from my understanding, by the time that we completed, this was not concluded yet. And if you're not, they are nowhere right now, but they're not completely out, they're not in. So this is the situation. The issue of the time frame also was not discussed. The time frame relates pretty much with the time frame for the implementation, whether it's going to be the period of 8 years or 10 years or whichever one that the parties will agree upon. And then there was the section B bis, which looks at the principles and approaches to guide the implementation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, what was not negotiated and perhaps which begs some little more attention relates to the issue of the background. In the introductory sections of the the framework, there's a lot of text which is quite important, because it's sometimes what informs those targets. So the thinking behind those targets is quite important. And this is those sections that include the background, the purpose, the relationship between the 2030 agenda and the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I should have actually started with the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework first, because it is the business. The theory of change, also quite important, And then there was a section H on implementation. I think a little bit of an introduction happened in the I think on the 28th of March, but there was not much discussed in that area. And yet this is an area which is quite important. The enabling conditions, as well as the issue of the planning, reporting and review and outreach. These ones were not well discussed. And I think another area which is quite important and is yet to be discussed, there is already a draft document out, but it was not discussed, is the area of the decision that will, or rather the draft COP decision. This is what is expected to operationalize the post-2020 framework once it has been adopted. So I think that it may not be in my very good place because of my position to say exactly why it did not happen. But one of the most outstanding reasons why this did not happen is also that the time was not, much as it was 3 weeks, it was a time that was shared between 3 different meetings. That is the SBI, Substa 24, and also the open-ended working group. So I think the time was not sufficient. I think the co-chairs in their wisdom decided to put some focus into this, and those are the areas that were focused on. So I believe that this is a good one to introduce. I think I did not do justice by not going into the exact details of those targets, just for the sake of those who may not know what those targets relate to. But I want to believe that this is something that you could quickly refer to even as we go through this. So thank you very much, and back to you, Simangele.
Thank you so much, Innocent, and you are right. We will add flesh into the skeleton with the next speakers on some of those targets. Thank you so much for giving us that overview of what was negotiated, what was partially negotiated, and what was not negotiated. Colleagues in the chat box, for those who need to refresh their memory, I have added the first draft of the post-2020. This will then allow you to see all those targets and the goals and the sections that Innocent is speaking about, so that you have an idea of which sections exactly were negotiated. If you have questions for Innocent, please put them in the chat box, because very soon I am going to open time for questions and comments for the speakers that have presented. In the meantime, I would love to call on our next speaker, Paul from Nature Kenya, who's been following closely the discussions and the background on resource mobilization, specifically on Target 19. I would love to invite you, Paul, to give your reflections on what Target 19 is about, how far this was negotiated in Geneva. What do you see as priority issues for Nairobi? And what are some of the policy options that you see? Thanks, and over to you, Paul. I can see your screen, but I cannot hear you. I can see you are unmuted. Geneva, please confirm if
okay, thank you. It's just telling me that I cannot put myself on video.
Okay, now I can hear you. You can continue. Thanks.
Good. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I wasn't organized enough to put together a good PowerPoint, but I seem to be having a technical glitch. Maybe I need to
Just to confirm, Paul,
Okay.
I can hear you clearly and I can see your slides, so it's fine on my side.
Okay, good, thank you. I think my screen is freezing on me.
I can see your title slide from my side.
Yes, but there seems to be a slight technical problem because the slide, yes, I think they are taking long. There is something I have done which is allowing me to
there's a slide, I think there's a slide on target 19, perhaps displaying, maybe you could just speak to it. I don't know. Sorry.
No, there is something wrong. Let me first, I will first escape. Where's top screen share? I need to stop screen share. Yeah. Sorry, members, I will be back shortly. Let me
No, that's
organize
great.
my.
Yeah, while Paul is preparing his slides, so we went into OEWG-3 with the first draft of the post-2020, but we came out of it with a document that has some composite text. So after the speakers have covered what was in the first draft and negotiations and so on, I will then share in the chat box for you what is currently in the text that came from there. I can see your screen is back up, Paul, so I'll go back to you.
Yes, if the screen misbehaves again, I will have to speak around the points without a PowerPoint. It's not a brilliant PowerPoint. I just organized it when Maloba was speaking to help me explain the points because I thought you might benefit more. The only hiccup is that they are refusing to scroll, but I will continue speaking and they will move at their pace. Can I be heard?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. So some of the background which we are looking at is the World Summit the World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa. The world began to say they want to have a significant change. And there it was about significantly reducing biodiversity loss by 2010, target missed. Then the world started planning under the CPD for a framework to save the planet. And it was not a strategic plan with the help. So 2020 targets with Aichi targets agreed in Nagoya, agreed. In German, parties began to say that there was need to increase financial resources for biodiversity. And that discussion peaked. But in Nagoya, the Aichi targets, the 2020 targets we talk about, were agreed. And generally, there was a divide between developed and the developing nations. Where developing nations wanted to tie financial resources, resource mobilization, to the agreement on the Aichi targets. And the developed nations were saying no, there was not enough data. A group of high panel experts had determined 400 billion was needed. But that data was described to be wanting because of what they described as methodological challenges. So resource mobilization strategy was not agreed in Nagoya. Went to Hyderabad years later after the 2020 targets had been agreed, and we began to negotiate. Baseline resources that we are being talked about as a baseline for negotiating were based on OECD DAC numbers, which they pushed us to accept the baseline. That time it was about $3.5 billion dollars. That was flowing. The Article 20 of the convention does imply that the extent to which developing nations are going to save nature, biodiversity in particular, will depend on the timeliness of developed nations to avail the resources, taking into account that developing nations' priority is poverty alleviation. So with that in mind, there seems to be differentiated roles within the convention, but there was a lot of pull and a push. At the end, in Hyderabad, it was agreed to double whatever resources that existed. We went to Egypt and we began to negotiate again, and there was all the intention to bring forward the Post-2020 framework ahead of resource mobilization. We spent sleepless nights, and at the end of it, we were able to get the need for resource mobilization to be done under the leadership of the Secretariat. And that led to a panel of experts that determined the needs. But then, since that time, more studies began by various stakeholders, and there seemed to be a major push towards trying to determine what is needed to ensure that the target is not missed. And that analysis, which has been done so far, is pointing to the need for a lot of money. That a lot of money is at the moment estimated to be nearly $1 trillion US dollars needed annually, with the numbers ranging from 500 and something to nearly 1 trillion. And those studies have been pulled together in what seemed to be general global consensus within the CBD fraternity to mean around 711 billion, taken to be 700 billion, is what is needed in order to fix the global challenges facing biodiversity. That's one point I wanted to pass through. And that point is increasingly being taken as a fact, because it's referenced by the panel of experts, is referenced by other studies that are credible and which are on the table. To the extent that that number was taken in by the co-chairs when they produced the first draft that was discussed in the year 2021, I think around August. The framework which was being presented to Geneva, Goldie had recognized that amount of 700 billion, which is a major gain in terms of thinking. But then similar analysis have been done around this number and breaking it down and where the biggest expenditure is. The high panel expert says that if the world can be sustainable, less resources will be required. Their numbers are around there about 300 billion. But these other studies which are credible and which are referenced to talk about 500 billion as the measure of resources needed in form of reducing harmful subsidies in order for the planet to produce in a more sustainable way. And so then if we become sustainable in the way we produce, the way we eat, the way we travel, the way we do everything in our lives, it's going to be cheaper for all of us. And what remains as the cheapest cost, if all the 500 billion can become available to reduce unsustainable production, is 200 billion annually needed within the planet to save biodiversity. So then the question that the conservation community has been asking themselves is, this 200 billion, where will it come from? And also these 500 billion, where will it come from? Is it hard cash or is it change of policy? But whatever it is packaged as money under 700 billion as the need, either for gone opportunities or change in behavior, which will cost. So assuming somehow miraculously the world can change behavior at once to become sustainable and the 500 billion can just disappear by way of behavior and approach of production, which we know is not as straightforward as that, then we have 200 billion to raise. How much of this should come from where? Studies have been done, and I'll be taking you through a little bit of analysis on this. For example, the IUCN determined that out of these 200 billion, 66 billion should come from developed nations, flowing to developing nations. Other studies have been done too to say, no, it should be 60 billion of the 200 billion flowing from developed nations to developing nations on the basis of the biodiversity threats which are faced globally. 30% of those threats are driven by developed nations' consumption, importing biodiversity degradation, with the developing nations exporting. But that is a global average. But then reading this, and this was basically me and discussing and consulting with others at Africa group of negotiators, looking at the literature that talks about 30% of trade contributing to biodiversity loss globally. Of this proportion, if you look at developing nations, the exporting of commodities is contributing to 50% of biodiversity loss within our region. That's developing nations. So then how should the cost be shared? We talk of sharing cakes. I don't know whether this one is a cake to share or this is a liability to share. How should it be shared? It is on the basis of that, and my slides are moving extremely slowly, and I cannot use them as the basis for the presentation because of the slow movement. I don't know what is causing it. It is on the basis of that that we came up with what is called Africa position. And that Africa position is asking, how are we going to raise these resources globally? Not for Africa, but for everyone. So the 700 billion is supported by studies that say you either take 700 billion or take 1% of GDP. So Africa thinks 1% of GDP is a good formula, which can cut across all countries to raise enough money, which comes to about 800 billion, to raise enough money to finance nature. Do you think it is adequate? That is backed by science at the moment. And then if you do that, you will have enough money to finance businesses that produce in unsustainable ways, because the foregone opportunities they have in order to be sustainable will cost them. So we cannot assume 500 billion will just become available, or those subsidies will be reduced at no cost. So the Africa position is calling for that. But of the 200 billion which remain as the gap after 700 billion, we say 50% of that to come from developed nations, because that's their share of destruction of biodiversity in developing countries. This does not include the shared cost of keeping species alive, whose benefits accrue to everyone. This is just compensating for the degradation that they cause as a result of their consumption. And there is also the level of degradation which is caused by our consumption and is not included in this analysis. So that comes to 100 billion needed. So if then we were to say we only go for the global average, they will need to have to give 60 billion. But if we go for fairness and get the shared contribution, then developed nations need to give in form of international grants 100 billion. Where are we? Where we are at the moment is that the global amount determined to be flowing from developed to developing nations is less than 10 billion. So the challenge is, will the world find this 200 billion or this 700 billion, or will developed nations find additional 10 billion in order to foot the bill on biodiversity? Those are the challenges. So our justification on this position is that 1% of global GDP is what will give us what we want. Where can we go for it? That harmful subsidies will cost 500 billion. We need this hard cash on the table. That the 200 billion should be the minimum, not working towards it, because studies show up to $1 trillion is needed annually. Then increase the international flows to the 1 billion per year based on the fairness on trade and the consumption. But this amount needs to be even higher because of the shared responsibility of taking care of species and protecting the sites. Taking into account at 420 of the convention, we haven't yet touched it in terms of the additional contribution. So even the 100 billion that remain, developed nations have an obligation to contribute. And by the way, if we were to use less diplomatic language, our biodiversity contributed to their development. So there's an element of right to contribute. And then these resources will need to flow and get other sectors involved. So Africa's position is saying, involve private sector, but come up with 1% of retail to go to biodiversity. And this amount of money can go to biodiversity funds. Africa is talking of African biodiversity funds, and there could be other funds global. But a lot of these resources should also go to indigenous communities who have been receiving less than $300 million annually for biodiversity conservation. And these are the people who are absorbing the costs. They have their crops, their livestock attacked, and they're actually killing wildlife. They are attacking trees by burning charcoal in order to live. And the governments in Africa are unable to compensate the loss of biodiversity caused by poverty. So a lot more resources need to flow so that protected area agencies are able to engage in biodiversity conservation. That's the Africa position. And in Geneva, what happened? We lost more than we gained. The recognition of the 700 billion under Gold D now sits as an observation elsewhere, I think in an annex. Target 19 being broken into two for the money and the capacity building. Both of them, the text is not agreed. And for the money coming to the meeting in Nairobi, I don't know how this divide is going to be resolved. There's a lot of work. I can only say, let's all pull in one direction. Ask our governments to contribute more, but also stand firm and if possible, try to have a post-2020 framework that is backed by sufficient timely financial resources. Otherwise, we will have another failed target in the name of 2030. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that comprehensive presentation. Colleagues, I will take one last presentation, which also links to resource mobilization. After it, we are going to take questions and comments. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat to avoid having a lot of hands coming during Q&A and so on. Next up, I would love to give the floor to Letitia from South Africa to give us updates on the item on digital sequence information. Letitia, over to you.
I'm trying to get my video. I don't know what is going on there. I'm trying to get my video activated. All right, I think now you can see me, Smangele?
Yes, I can see you. I can see your screen and I can hear you perfectly.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come and share some update in terms of what transpired in Geneva and what is going to happen in Kenya, in Nairobi. So my presentation is going to cover 4 aspects. I felt that for me to be able to give you information about what actually happened in Geneva, I should start from where the process that led to a Geneva discussion happened. So I felt that let me start from the establishment of the Co-Chairs Informal Advisory Group, because that is where all things started, and then share with you a little bit of the report of the advisory group, and then I'll then share with you the Geneva negotiations outcomes and also what is planned as an approach for the upcoming open-ended working group, the 4th one. So in terms of the establishment of the advisory group, you'll recall that during the first part of the 3rd open-ended working group, we actually went into the negotiations and we were then asked to consider a set of documents. It was a mix of formal and informal document produced. I'm referring to the ATEC report, which was mainly a formal process document plus a lot of information that was generated through informal process by the co-chair through webinars. But that process actually produced some interesting information on DSI. It was more on the policy options as well as the criteria for assessing those policy options, when the ATEC report was more technical and focusing on clarifying the topic on the concept and the terminology for DSI, as we all know that DSI is still a placeholder. So at the first part of the open-ended working group, I think the negotiation resulted with so much text in a composite sort of a draft element of the recommendations that were going to COP15. But in addition to that, I think the parties realized that for this text to be really streamlined and focused, there is a need to have what we call an advisory group, which should be established by the co-chairs of the working group. And that is how we ended up having what we call the co-chairs advisory group on DSI. And they were given this mandate. These are the 4 tasks that they were allocated to focus on between the time from the first part of the 3rd open-ended working group up until the Geneva meeting. So they actually spent some time to look at the assessment of consequences of possible policy approaches, options, and modalities for benefit sharing from the utilization of DSI. And then they also looked at areas of potential convergence and divergence, because where people are interacting, areas of divergence and divergence are possible. So there was that aspect at a second mandate for the group to look at, and also look at areas of additional work that could be done between, at that moment, the final 3rd open working group and the COP15, and also gathering some studies, dialogues, and views from formal and informal activities, because we learned that there's a lot of information that is so useful, which is generated through informal processes. And for that information, there's a web portal that has been established by the Secretariat. I think it's important for you participants to note that link, because if you go there, that is where you're gonna find all latest and previous published information on DSI, if you really want to build your capacity and understanding about where things are. And yeah. So in terms of the work of the advisory group, this is just the schedule, the plan, just to share with you that They started working in August and finished their work in November 2021. But what actually came out of that meeting? So because the work was more on the assessment of option, and remember when they were working on the policy option, there was also a call for additional views on the policy option approaches and modalities. And then already when we went to the advisory group work, Africa has already put forward its proposal on the policy option. And you will see that what we have now as part of the list of the policy option is now a total of 6. And when we went to the first working group, the first part, building up from the webinar, we had only 5 options of the policy option. So we now have the 6th option, which is about 1% levy on retail sales of genetic resources, which will be payment on retail sales into a multilateral mechanism. So this is an additional option that was added by Africa during the negotiation. So currently, in terms of the status quo, the DSI negotiating teams are looking at 6 options. And these 6 options are going to be taken through a process, which was agreed by the advisory group. But one more thing to also share with you is that as much as Africa suggested its fixed option, there were also other parties that proposed what we call hybrid options. So we have 6 independent policy options plus 2 hybrid options. And these 2 hybrid options, they are described as follows, that there must be option 1 and 2.2 can be combined. And then that will depend on whether a single or multiple DSI was used and whether the country of origin of the genetic resource is known. And then the second option for hybrid, which is also looking at the same option, but the description is a little bit different. Here they are talking about option 1 and option 2.2. And they're saying this hybrid option will only apply where the country of origin is unknown. And then that's when they will employ internationally standardized mutually agreed terms. Where the country of origin is known, benefits must be shared with the provider country. So that means it's a bilateral process. So what I'm trying to say is the first group, 0 to 6, is going to be taken through a process, which has been designed by the advisory group. Of course, the hybrid option will also follow suit, but the approach is not to deal with them at this stage. So the advisory group actually produced what we call a multi-criteria analysis, and with this performance matrix. So all these 6 options are going to be evaluated or assessed against this cluster of 4 major criteria and 19 sub-criteria, which I'm not going to go through them because I think this is work that was looked at in Geneva, but I'm just sharing this is work that was produced by the advisory group and considered in Geneva. So there's this criteria that is going to be utilized to do the assessment of all these policy options individually. And the purpose for this assessment is to narrow the options, because we cannot say we have a DSI solution by having these 6 options. In the end, we are looking for DSI solution, not DSI solutions, I think, from my understanding. So now, still on the work of the advisory group preparing for Geneva. So they also produced this set of areas of convergence and divergence. And I think by just a look on this slide, you'll be able to tell if the majority of issues are on the divergence or convergence. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but the major element that we're taken through the convergence and divergence is fair and equitable benefit sharing, open access of DSI in public databases, the role of IPLC and traditional knowledge, capacity building, linkages between ABS access, benefit and sharing, and access and benefit sharing, the linkages between the concept itself, legal clarity and certainty, and then consistency with existing laws, decisions, and other forums. So you can see the areas of convergence and the divergence. In some area, there's nothing at all. So these areas of divergence, they end up at this level, and then we still have traceability, importance of the CPD and the SDGs, importance of DSI in research and conservation, future-proofing, scope of the CPD, and the Nagoya Protocol. From this slide, you can see already there are no divergence. It's only one area of divergence right at the bottom in terms of the scope of the CPD. So now I'm moving on to the next level of the outcome of the advisory group. What I'm sharing with you here is the high-level criteria or principle for DSI solution, including points for consideration by the co-leads. So basically, the co-leads, after listening and gathering all the views and the input, they then put forward some potential element of a recommendation that could be considered as part of the COP decision. So those are under category A, where we put any benefits from the use of genetic resources should be shared in a fair and equitable way, and solutions should be found on how to share benefits sharing from the use of DSI. And access to DSI in public databases remain open. IPLC as steward of biodiversity and their role and rights will be taken into account in addressing DSI. And then capacity building is an integral part of the solution on DSI. And then also they highlighted some areas for further consideration towards the convergence, which I will not look into them, but it was more about further opportunity to explore all the issues as they are raised. And also the last part looking at the mandate to advance work on the multi-criteria analysis. What is important on this section is that the work on the assessment of the policy option through the multi-criteria analysis was then decided that it will require an independent expert. And the Secretariat has since appointed that expert, and they're busy working on the assessment criteria. So now this is what actually went to Geneva. So what did the Geneva negotiators did after getting that document? They considered all the outcome from the advisory group, and then they decided to put together some recommendations. We had two sets of recommendations, one going to the open-ended working group and the other one going to the COP15. But when this work was actually started, I think we collected quite a number of texts with a lot of brackets around a certain section of the draft decision for the working group as well as for the COP. And then what then happened in Geneva, then the co-lead decided to establish what we call a friend of the co-leads, who then spent, I think, 2 days up until the early morning of the 28th, trying to resolve the text that should go into the recommendations for the open-ended working group. And they successfully managed to come up with this clean text on the recommendation for the working group that recognizes that a solution for fair and equitable benefit sharing on DSI should inter alia be efficient, feasible, and practical, generate more benefits, including both monetary and non-monetary than cost, be effective, provide certainty, and legal clarity for providers and users of DSI should not hinder research and innovation, should be consistent with open access to data, not be incompatible with international legal obligation, and be mutually supportive of other access and benefit sharing instruments, take into account the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including with respect to TK associated with genetic resources that they hold. And then these recommendations then was followed by the sixth one, where they recognizes that the monetary and non-monetary benefits arising from the use of DSI should in particular be used to support conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and inter alia benefits indigenous people and local community. But there's a footnote that is attached to para 5, and this footnote was actually included after the process was stopped on the during plenary, during the adoption of this recommendation by Bolivia and Indonesia, thinking that this is the final way forward or decision on DSI. Then we ended up putting a footnote to say this list is not exhaustive. A more extended list is included in the proposed decision for the conference of the parties for later debate. Like I said, what came out of Geneva was the section of the open-ended working group and the section of the COP15 as part of the draft decision. So now still on this one, on the outcome. So then building up on the paragraph 5 and 6, then the parties decided to request the advisory group on DSI to continue their work on the assessment of consequences of potential policy approaches, options, and modalities for benefit sharing arising out of the utilization of DSI. Then based on those elements that I've shared with you, in addition, they were also tasked to provide advice on the following areas. The first one was on the hybrid approaches that I've just shared with you, option and modalities. The findings from the assessment referred the assessment by the expert, element of a definition for digital sequence information on genetic resources based on the work of the ATEC. Remember, I shared with you what ATEC produced. So this group was then tasked to also look at those elements. Legal feasibility, tracking and tracing, and also look at the next step in the approach that should be considered, and also the roles and rights, interests of indigenous people and local communities, the roles and interests and implication for the scientific research communities, private sector, and all of them. So, but this work of the advisory group in terms of this decision is for the co-chairs to report to COP15. That's how the work of the advisory group on this 8 elements is going to be taken forward. So now, what is it that the advisory group has done after Geneva? This is their plan, their work plan to deal with those issues that I've just shared with you. So the advisory group are working parallel to the independent assessment of the policy options. And we have put a plan to conclude the work after open-ended, the 4th open-ended working group. You can see there's a 6th meeting there that is scheduled to happen after Nairobi. So in terms of the status of where things are, many of the meetings has already taken place. There was a session on definition, the session on IPLC, modalities, tracking and tracing, hybrid approaches, roles of stakeholders. So we have already dealt with those issues, and the approach was inviting various experts to come and share a presentation, and it was like maybe per topic we'll have about 6 or 5 experts sharing their views and ideas on that particular topic. So we left with actually one meeting before Nairobi, and that meeting is going to focus on the legal feasibility and also the next step, and maybe the report that will be considered after Geneva. And then the policy appraisal will be looked at if it's ready by the time maybe we convene. That is the assessment that is being done by the experts. So now, what is the expectation for Geneva, Nairobi now? Because the work is happening with the advisory group, and I've shared with you what is going to happen with the report of that work. So in Nairobi, the co-lead will provide a report in plenary of the work that I've just shared with you. That is planned to happen on the 21st of June, the first day of the meeting. And then there's a contact group on DSI that is scheduled for the evening of the 22 June 2022. And I know according to the plan that the co-chair produced, there's an opportunity for additional contact group based on how the work has progressed. So what will the contact group be requested to focus on? They're going to work further on the draft COP decision that is contained in part 2 of the open-ended working group 3 report. And that draft document is heavily bracketed. There is no text that shows some element of agreement. And that is where we also find the African position on option 6 in detail there in terms of the modality and how they see it implemented. And I think that was my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Letitia, and again for the background that takes us to where we are. Colleagues, just to remind us, this is a meeting for us to stock take on OEWG-3, unpack what's going to be priorities for OEWG-4, not necessarily a place for us to agree on positions, but also a place for us to share perspectives. I have noted 2 questions in the chat that I will call up colleagues to actually ask their questions themselves. Please keep your question below a minute, when you ask it. There is a question from Helena, and there's a question from Malta, Helena, can you please start with your question? Malta, you will follow, and then the speakers can take the questions at once. Helena, you have the floor. You are muted, Helena, in case you are asking behind the mic. You are now unmuted, but I cannot hear you. So in the meantime, Malta, can I please ask you to ask your question? And Mustafa, your hand is noted. You will follow Malta. Malta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much. My question is directed to Dr. Matiku on resource mobilization. I just want to check, he gave a split of the, he first mentioned, I hope I understood because I'm not a finance person. He gave a split, he first highlighted the 700 billion shortfall funding gap. And he gave a split of 500 billion under target 18 and 200 billion under target 19.1. I just want to check with him, what is his opinion on the split? Because if we've got a funding gap of 700 billion and we are given a huge chunk to go and look for it outside, and we are promised only a small amount of 200 billion, and 500 is not counted. Is it a fair thing to say we want the 700 billion funding gap to be settled before we are told to go and look for money elsewhere? I don't know whether that is a fair question or fair request to make, because I'm fearing a situation where we are told the package deal is included in the 500 billion. And we accept that as a fair package deal for the implementation of the GBF, only to find later on that we only have 200 billion out of the 700 billion. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Malta. Mustafa, I will take your question. I see your hand is up. You can take the floor.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Regarding the whole issue of resource mobilization, I am in the view that we should not spend a lot of time discussing issues, whatever. We are going for negotiations. That means we have a text and which is heavily bracketed, and our main job is to reduce as much as we can during the next meeting in Nairobi. Having said that, it is very clear, at least to me, we know how much money is being used and where the money, particularly most of it come from public. Number two, we know the gaps. And regardless of all of these studies, whatever, we have to focus on 1% of the retail price, if that is acceptable by everybody. I know it is not an easy, especially nowadays, but we have to make it very clear how much money they spend over the last couple of months. For example, in the whole issue of Ukraine and whatever. This is a main issue that I would think we should focus. We are not going to discuss details. We are going just only to negotiate for a proper text that is acceptable to us. The same thing applied to DSI. I mean, many studies already we have in matter. But Patricia made a fantastic revision, which we should encourage her, acknowledge her, and then we should follow very, very clear what is needed to be done. If they are not going to respond to that, we have to show our teeth. And this is a time. This is a time actually. And both of the resource mobilization and the SI, they should be linked together. Otherwise, no GBF. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Helena, allow me to read your question and then I'll give you an opportunity when you present later. The question was, can DSI and resource mobilization be a deal breaker for the post-2020? I would love to go back to the speakers. You each have 2 minutes each, sorry to be unfair, to respond to the questions, and you can add the extra responses in the chat box. Paula will start on your side, since a lot of comments were on resource mobilization.
Thank you very much. And yes, we meant resource mobilization in India a deal breaker. And it was possible for our position to double resources by 2015 to be adopted. In Nagoya, we failed. In the past, developing nations, negotiations were very easy because developing nations wanted to be told, thank you, very good, excellent, being rated by others. I think Africa and the developing nations are now out of being congratulated and being rated and being told they are doing the right things to the level of standing firm and knowing what we want and placing it on the table. If we take that approach, we are going to gain, even if not everything. Yes, 700 billion is what we've been told, not by ourselves, by the experts, using resources not from us, but from others who have the resources, so they know. The 500 billion harmful subsidy, the trick is we could take it as given that everything is going to become sustainable, that our tea is sustainable, our coffee is sustainable, our rice is sustainable, our meat is sustainable, everything is sustainable, it's not impacting biodiversity by way of producing. Is that going to be the case? We know it is not as straightforward as such. It will cost. So unfortunately, 500 billions reduction in harmful subsidies may be seen in form of cash. How that cash is presented is a different subject. And whether that should be under target 18 or 19 is another subject. Then the 200 hard cash is money to be raised. Yes, this we have to find ways of getting to negotiate. But remember, nothing is coming easy. And if we go and we leave the negotiators the way it happened in the past, at 2 o'clock, they will remove all the brackets. So let's remove the brackets, but let's remove the brackets with our content inside, not to remove the brackets by compromising everything about us. But we want an ambitious post-2020 framework. With or without additional money is useful. But are we going to take it to save the world, to save the planet using our people, while others are enjoying and are spending much more money on entertainment than biodiversity needs, and then we fail again? Those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. And we need that commitment to agree, but have true ways of saving the planet by moving in the resources. Even our governments need to raise more. 1% of GDP is a formula for everyone. The return does not take into account that for 20 of the convention is a unifying factor. We can contribute according to our contribution. Even 1% of individual income, if policies were to be enacted, we were told by IFBES, the change must be transformative, must be immediate, must be major. What is it? Business as usual? As Africa, let's try to save our planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for those perspectives. And I believe the question of the deal breaker is somehow answered already. Can I invite both of you and Letitia to respond to some questions in the chat box? I've also uploaded Paul's presentation in the chat box as well. Now we will move to other issues. A day is never enough to cover this, so forgive me if you still wanted us to stay. I will move over to your side, Pierre, to give us updates on how far we are with negotiations on Target 3 on area-based conservation and Target 5 on sustainable use. You have the floor.
Thank you, Simangele. Hello, everyone. Can you please confirm you hear me, see me, and see my presentation?
Yes, I can hear you, see you, and your presentation. It's just not on presentation mode yet. Thank you.
There you go. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to look at Target 3, which is on area-based conservation, and at Target 5 on sustainable use. So in the first draft of the GBF, Target 3, this is the text of it, right? I mean, this is basically what has also become known as the 30 by 30 target. So by 2030, 30% of land and sea areas, especially areas particularly important for biodiversity and its contributions to people, are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and integrated into the wider landscapes and seascapes. Now, as you might know, there's this High Ambition Coalition for Nature, which is basically a political club kind of co-chaired by France and Costa Rica, or the UK co-chairing on the marine part of it, or the sea areas. That has been going around and collecting political commitments to this target of 30 by 30. And unfortunately, that has turned out to be quite divisive in Africa, because about half of African countries, their leaders have made a political commitment to 30 by 30, and the negotiators now have to defend that position. And unfortunately, also, I mean, you know, agreeing to one part of a negotiation before everything else has been considered, of course, undermines negotiating positions. So they basically accepted 30 by 30, which is one of the headlines that the developed countries are promoting. If you read the developed country press, you will see that 30 by 30 is basically, if they want to summarize the outcome of the GBF negotiations in one phrase, 30 by 30 is it. It is a bit like the 1.5% target of the Paris Agreement. So then so there is this division in Africa. We had a process in the African group of negotiators to come up with some compromise language that everyone in Africa could support. And we went to Geneva and we negotiated, and this was what we got. Can someone please mute? Yeah, thank you, Bernard. Thank you for the host. Now, if you've looked at the outcome of the Geneva meeting, you will see that this is not. It may be a little bit more bracketed and complicated than some of the other texts, but actually most of them are like this. All right. So just to highlight some of the discussions around this. Even in Africa, some of the countries that support 30 by 30 say, oh, it's only a global target and we won't necessarily have to meet that at the national level. Those who oppose it, they say, well, if we agree to it as a global target, then how are we going to meet that if it's not met at the national level? Or if every nation doesn't make a sincere effort to get there? Because mathematically, it doesn't stack up, right? If nationally you're only going to conserve 20%, that means that some other nations will have to conserve much more. And those might not necessarily be areas that are important for biodiversity. So this, whether it's a global or national target and how the global target gets implemented at the national level is a big issue to consider. There's also, from an African perspective, very important considerations that to just formally declare protected areas is actually not going to work, right? I mean, you have this crazy situation, for example, where the United Kingdom has all of these marine protected areas, but in 96% of them, they still do bottom trawling, which is the most destructive form of fishing for biodiversity. So there's a real danger that if you just focus on the area and the percentage of the area, then you will get these paper parks with no resources to manage them well, and basically no impact on biodiversity beyond sort of meeting a formal target. And that, of course, is an additional aspect of that, is that to really have an impact on biodiversity, these areas must be well managed, they must be equitably governed, they must be ecologically representative, they must connect ecosystems to each other. And in African context especially, they must also include other effective area-based conservation measures, like indigenous and community conserved areas, which are, a lot of African biodiversity occurs in that areas where people live with biodiversity all the time and have to depend on biodiversity for their livelihoods. Right? So because of that, one of the aspects that's been introduced into this text now is this idea of ensuring that sustainable use in these areas where it happens contributes to biodiversity conservation. Although, now some of our negotiating partners are arguing that target is not about sustainable use, it is only about conservation. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Yeah, so I mean, here's what I've highlighted here in yellow. The national contributions to this global target will be decided according to national priorities and capabilities, with adequate safeguards for the rights of IPLCs and the right to development. It's actually also, there's a United Nations Declaration on the right to economic development. And that this national implementation and failing to meet the global target of 30% at a national level will not affect the rights and abilities of all parties to access financial and other resources for implementation. So that was compromise text that was developed by the African group and put into this negotiating text. And there seems to be, there's also, I think, a general recognition that the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities must be taken into account when designating protected areas. Now, moving on to target 5, which is about sustainable use. Of course, in Africa, sustainable use of biodiversity, as I've just explained in the context of protected areas, is really, really important. People rely for a significant part of their livelihood on harvesting and consuming and trading and using wild species. So the target 5 in the first draft of the GBF was actually very straightforward. It said ensure that the harvesting, trade and use of wild species is sustainable, legal and safe for human health. Now, the safe for human health, of course, comes from the connection between bats and other wildlife and the COVID epidemic, but also other outbreaks of zoonotic diseases that originate from animals. Now, this whole aspect of the safe for human health or safe for animal health, or whatever, is echoed in other parts of the GBF. And there seems to be an obsession with this idea that biodiversity somehow uniquely poses a threat to human health. But actually, most of the zoonotic diseases that have real pandemic potential occur in livestock, come from chickens and pigs, and especially chickens and pigs from intensively farmed systems. Or, you know, the mares, for example, that came from camels. So it's not unique to wild species. You know? And so again, when we negotiated this, and this was not as heavily negotiated, if I recall, as target 3, but all of these additional concepts were introduced. And the divide here is really between those who would not want to see sustainable use of wild species, and would go as far as including, you know, not just over-exploitation, but including harvesting, exploitation, captive breeding, farming, trade, and use. So basically would prevent much of what is actually happening in Africa and needs to continue to happen. Again, the focus on wild species as opposed to all potential sources of zoonotic diseases is a distortion of the reality. But really what we're after is to ensure that sustainable use is in fact sustainable and legal. I mean, you all know we have a problem with illegal resource use in Africa. And you know, we have continental agreements on making sure that you know, that poaching is stopped and that wildlife trade is legal. I mean, so there's an argument about how this is to be done. You know, is it to be regulated? This is to be legislated? You know, how will it be enforced, etc. Here, the issue of pathogen spillover is very clearly introduced into the language now. And then there was also, you know, this added element which actually comes from benefit sharing, which is that sustainable use should not serve as a, you know, as a cover for biopiracy and lead to illegal access and transfer of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. And again, the issue was of respecting IPLC rights and customary use, you know, was introduced into the text. Then right at the end of the process, there's this alt text, which the co-chairs of that contact group proposed, which basically talks about eliminating all harvesting, trade, and use that is illegal, unsustainable, or unsafe, while safeguarding customary rights of IPLCs. So it's a little bit better than the original text in that it talks about eliminating the negative aspects of sustainable use. Potential negative aspects. So very briefly, what can we look forward to at OEWG-4 with a big question mark, because I don't have a crystal ball, but here are some of my thoughts on it. As Innocent explained in his first presentation, the start will be, I mean, we will start with those parts of the GBF that have not been negotiated at all, and you know, if the past is any way to judge what will happen in the future, then we're probably going to end up with similarly complicated texts, as I've just demonstrated here with these two targets. And I think Mustafa made the point in his intervention that we really need to focus on simplifying this text and getting to something that, you know, that can be agreed by all. And then there is at the moment in the timetable quite a lot of unallocated time in the agenda for Nairobi. So we will be able to go back to other parts of the text. But on the basis of these complicated texts, there needs to be, then there would need to be extraordinary efforts on the sidelines, so to speak, to come to a compromise. So there's a big question mark as well about how much compromise is actually possible within the course of 5 days of negotiating a very complicated instrument. And then there's this question. I mean, we've been talking for a while now about that COP15 will, that there will be a package deal, but we haven't really talked about what the elements of those package deal could be and how they would balance up against each other. So of course, resource mobilization is probably Africa. It is in fact Africa's top priority. I mean, we have said very clearly that for us to adopt the Global Biodiversity Framework, we would need to see resource mobilization that matches the level of ambition in the framework itself. And we have also said that we expect that the framework will contain a solution for sharing benefits from the use of digital sequence information, because if it doesn't, then digital sequence information will basically undermine the third objective of the convention, and thereby, because the three objectives are interlinked, undermine the whole implementation of the convention. Another element of the package deal is probably this conservation target. Whether it will turn out to be 30 by 30 is not clear yet, but clearly there is a strong desire from some parties to have a conservation, area-based conservation target, and that would probably be part of the package deal. Now, from an African perspective, sustainable use and ecosystem restoration are the real priorities on the ground, of course, and that's what the resource mobilization is supposed to support, right? Also, there's a lot of strong political leadership in Africa around sustainable use and ecosystem restoration. So one of the proposals from Africa has been that, in fact, sustainable use could provide a source of compromise, because sustainable use leads to conservation and sustainable use drives benefit sharing, and you get a virtuous cycle where the benefit sharing serves as an incentive for sustainable use, and then you get good conservation outcomes. And this is particularly important in the context of climate change and all of the environmental changes that are going on in the world, right? I mean, we can no longer just look at conservation. We need to look at adapting to climate change. We need to help biodiversity adapt to climate change. We need to move our economic development pathways in a way that will respond to climate change, and at the same time not destroy biodiversity, which is a very tricky thing to do in the African context, because the population will double by 2050, and it will mostly be young people, and they need livelihood opportunities. So that sustainable use, ecosystem restoration, paying people to look after biodiversity is actually a very rational and probably achievable way forward for Africa. To do that, we're going to need a lot of capacity development and technology transfer. We already knew that 30 years ago when we negotiated the CBD, and we also know that that those two things are very important parts of benefit sharing. That's why, there's separate articles in the CBD about them, but there's no separate article about benefit sharing, because the understanding at the time was that in addition to monetary benefit sharing, there will be capacity development, technology transfer. And I think the key to making this package deal is for everyone to acknowledge that the CBD is not primarily a conservation instrument. It is actually a sustainable development instrument, right? Of course, conservation is one of its very important aims. It's its first objective. It was the reason for negotiating the instrument. But after negotiating it, the deal that was made was there will be benefit sharing for sustainable use so that we can get conservation, so that conservation becomes an economically realistic outcome of human activities. And then there's a big question, right? I mean, if there's no ambition, there's also no political incentive to provide means of implementation. And means of implementation, goes beyond resource mobilization. So it's resource mobilization plus technology transfer plus capacity building. plus probably facilitating, access to all of the means of implementation for those people who really need to do it because they are the biodiversity stewards. In other words, the indigenous peoples and local communities who live with biodiversity all the time and make daily livelihood decisions that either increase biodiversity or, or harms it. And so the question really for Geneva and for the ability to achieve a compromise and a package deal there, sorry, not for Geneva, for Nairobi, is if we add adequate means of implementation and high ambition together, will that equal the transformative change that we have all agreed is necessary to save biodiversity? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pierre, for that background of where we are. Colleagues, I think you saw the text that Pierre showed us of how we went into Geneva and the text that we came out with. I have also attached the document in the chat box that's going to show you all of that new text for all of the other targets. We already have quite a number of questions, so I am going to take a few hands. There's a hand I didn't take last time of BK Kakuyo. You will be the first one. There's a hand that has been up ever since then, so I'm not sure if it's for the last session or for now, but I will also take that hand of Dia Abdul. And the last hand that I see is of Mustafa. So in that order, can I please take those questions, starting with BK Kakuyo?
Thank you, Simangele. This is Kakuyo from Uganda. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, my question previously was about the figure of $200 billion. The question was to Paul. I think in discussions informally with some of the parties from the developed world, there doesn't seem to be much divergence about that figure of 200 billion. What is in question now is about the source of raising that $200 billion, whether from 1% GDP or 1% retail. And so the discussion seemed to indicate that this is going to be a big area of contention. And so what is our strategy for sticking to this figure? What is it that we can compromise on, if at all? Because there is going to be a big fight around that figure and the source of that figure. Thank you. I would have liked to make a comment on the presentation by Pierre about the target 3, but let me reserve that for now. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. I hope you've noted that question, Paul. I'll take another question. Dia Abdul, you have the floor.
Merci, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Dia Abdul de la Mauritanie.
Thank you very much. My name is Dia Abdul from Mauritania. I would like to congratulate all the speakers. Without going into too much details, I would like to highlight 2 important things. Number 1, the use of DSI for biodiversity. And secondly, resource mobilization. I hope we are going to find a compromise without compromising the interests of the continent. I think most of the time we talked about biodiversity, and typically we'll have an expert group in charge of resource mobilization. But on the ground, particularly in Africa, in West Africa, most of the funds that are channeled to Africa are used in different ways. It's good to fight to ensure that we get the fund, but it's also important to ensure that the funds that arrive are used to protect the biodiversity. I know that there are many institutions in charge of biodiversity, conservation, and climate change, but we need to build capacity by investing in institutions, in learning institutions such as universities and research institutes. Maybe even create a research institute at the regional level that will train a new generation of young people who be given capacities to really protect biodiversity. I think it's really critical to establish institutions at the local level and also support the creation of a new generation that would protect biodiversity on the ground. I know maybe Africa, we are not in a better position as far as the fund is concerned, but we need to continue working on how to better protect biodiversity in Africa through the training and the strengthening of capacities of our youth and also of learning institutions in Africa. We need to continue fighting for a specific percentage of funding, but we need to go beyond. In Mauritania, for instance, which is a country that has 75% of its territory affected by desert, need to ensure that the population living in those areas are prepared and given the necessary tools to deal with the climate change and protect biodiversity. So what we really need is support at the local level. We could be also doing exchange of experience and also train. I know that at the end of the day, there will be an agreement. We will find a compromise in terms of resource mobilization. But when we come back to Africa, what is going to happen on the ground is also something that we should focus on. So in short, we need to allocate more funding to capacity building for institutions and people on the ground. We also need to support learning institutions at the university level. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for those comments and really emphasizing that a lot of work also needs to be done on the implementation side of things. I'll take the last hand up, and I believe, Paul, you have not forgotten the question that was addressed to you. Mustafa, your hand is up. You can take the floor.
Thank you very much. I fully support the last slide of Bia that speak about three things, starting with the text that was not negotiated. Number two, if the time allow, we visit some of the texts, which to a great extent is not bad. And thirdly, we can focus now on the package deal of all of these elements that already presented. This is, if we focus on all of these, I'm sure that the next meeting in Nairobi could be a very, very successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Helena, I saw you had a question that was addressed to Pierre. Can I please ask you to take the floor and ask your question?
Well, my question was basically about the transfer of technology and what sort of technologies we are talking about, And I mentioned gene editing and gene drives, which many countries in the north and many scientific organizations and interested people want to transfer. And Pierre answered that question fairly comprehensively by saying that the official African position endorsed at the highest political level and included in Agenda 2063 is that Africa needs modern biotechnology to address our multiple development challenges. And of course, we must take heed of the biosafety aspects, and the danger of increasing corporate control is very real. So I think that that answers my question. I think the main thing is who is in control of deciding what kind of, for example, genome editing is investigated, and in particular, that Africa is not used as an experimental laboratory for these kinds of technologies, which I feel is a real danger. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those reflections. Kakuyo, you had mentioned that you have comments on Pierre's presentation. So I see your hand is up and I will take your hand as the last one for this round.
Thank you, Simangele. It's basically a very brief concern about the fact that Africa failed to speak with one voice with regard to Target 3, and that it was extremely embarrassing for us to be seen to be fighting each other on the floor of the conference in Geneva, and that there are efforts outside the Africa group that seem to have played a hand in terms of dividing the Africa group. So I wanted to raise this concern and see how best we can avoid it going into Nairobi on several issues, not just Target 3, that we need to continue speaking with one voice as Africa, not allow external forces to divide us on issues that we all face equally across the region. That was just a brief comment, especially on Target 3. Thank you, Simangele.
Thank you so much. Can I please ask you, Paul, to respond to the question of where is this 200 billion coming from? After that, I will give you the floor, Pierre, to reflect on some of the comments that were made in line with your presentation. Paul, over to your side.
Thank you very much. It's actually not even the 200 billion. Yes, that's agreed. But also the 500 billion subsidies, much discussion to also see that as money, which must be raised. Because there are many who are very comfortable that 500 out of this big number, 700, 500 is harmful subsidies, target 18, done. Problem is 200 billion, agreed. But now, where will it come from? 1% of GDP will give us 800 billion if governments can agree. And this is a formula for everyone. That means, like Kenya gave the ministries that are responsible for environment a total Kenya shillings 20.8 billion in the current budget estimate. This will come to 100 billion. If Kenya gets 100 billion today, that change is going to be transformative. And we have seen big money being found when there is a big issue on the table. So biodiversity has become big. So it will come from governments. It will, and the taxpayers through their budgeting. Also, business is being touted as one of the entrants in biodiversity, although they are not a party. 1% of retail, if we agree, will generate significant income. Then on what strategies, and some of them have been listed. In Hyderabad, we succeeded because we used science-based approach. The start of high panel assessments and having 400 billion, even when denied, meant something in people's minds. Developed nations' arguments that there was no baseline upon which to double resources meant a lot of sense, but they forgot they were pushing a baseline under OECD. So when we failed to get the 200 billion or 400 billion, at the end of it, we said, let's use your baseline and let's double it. And their negotiation collapsed. So this time, we've been helped in a big way by science, and the numbers are there and are not being disputed. But the basis of lack of commitment is the one that is derailing the negotiations. And the wanting to move the burden, pass the burden to others to take responsibility. And that's the issue need to be addressed. So we need this science-led approach and not get out of it, supplemented with high political support, high level engagement, if we can grow these demands to a high level, not just ourselves trying to process texts, because the negotiations take place at that level. We need to try as much as possible not to be influenced. At a higher level, deals are cut and we get to lose. And so that how we secure that is the challenge. How we can be resilient during the negotiations so that at 5 a.m. in the morning, brackets are not all removed because we are absent in the negotiating tables. But before then, we need to understand that that is the value of this meeting. All of us need to understand. So then the burden of negotiating and sitting late, there can be enough people speaking the same language, pushing the same agenda during these meetings and not being divided. We can be divided on other matters, but if we get divided on money, resource mobilization, we lose everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that closing soundbite, Paul. Pierre, on your side, the reflections, a couple of comments came based on your presentation.
Thank you. I thought I'd answered all of the questions in the chat box actually, but let me just make a quick observation while you've given me the floor about the link between DSI resource mobilization, the Global Fund, and the Global Multilateral Benefit Sharing Mechanism. The Global Fund is really designed to address transfers from developed countries to developing countries. The Global Multilateral Benefit Sharing Mechanism, on the other hand, is intended to capture the money directly from, basically from purchases by consumers in developed countries and channel that towards IPLCs that actually actively conserve biodiversity. And it's different in that sense, in that whether the money comes or not is not dependent on whether the UK is running a budget surplus or a deficit, or whether there's a global recession, or whether there's a pandemic. All of that, or whether there's a war in Ukraine, right? I mean, so during all of that, the retail sales still go on, and it will be a very predictable flow of money to the grassroots level. Whether it will be sufficient depends on how effectively the system is implemented, but it certainly has the capacity to channel money from where the benefits are ultimately derived to where the support for biodiversity is needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those reflections, Pierre. I've seen these questions from Johnson on DSI. Colleagues kindly attended to them. We are going to the last speaker, touching yet another very important topic that is seen on target 14 and 15 of the first draft, which is mainstreaming and also business engagement. For this one, I would love to give the floor to Helena. And yeah, while she puts up a screen, just to remind you to put the questions in the chat box and for other colleagues to respond. Specifically, I would love to encourage the CSO members to put their questions in the chat as well. Thanks, Helena, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I will be brief because I know we don't have much time left. So I'll just say that in Geneva, There's some good language proposed for some of these targets, and it's very difficult to reach meaningful compromise. And I think a basic problem lies in the structure of the GBF and also in these targets. I'll explain. As with mainstreaming, which these targets 14 to 16 and most of the rest of them, certainly up to 19, are supposed to cover, mainstreaming and these 3 targets carefully separate government, business and people. And that means that target 14 doesn't name government as responsible for regulation. In target 15, business is asked to self-report and self-regulate without accountability. And in target 16, people are left to address overconsumption and corporate deception alone without any regulatory framework. And I think we can agree that given the power of corporations and their supply lines and so forth, this is not likely to work. The role of government in this is absolutely vital. The relationship between government, business and society. So it's deliberately omitted in a way any kind of discussion of the relationship. And there is such a major imbalance of power between government, business and people, and we have to address this. So I know the CBD can't regulate, but it should instruct parties to do so. And governments need to regulate and control business. I think it's a very interesting aspect, the business of advertising and persuading people to overconsume addictive products with offers and advertising with huge health impacts. And we also need adequate information for people so they can make real choices and access good quality food without destroying biodiversity. So we need regulation from several different angles. So target 14, governments have to be the primary actors, as I said, and I think the NBSAPs need to be developed as comprehensive overarching policy instruments. And they need to be updated once the GBF is adopted, so the GBF needs to be strong. We need a whole of government approach. And I just wanted to say that 14 bis, as discussed in Geneva, which appears right at the end of the report on the Geneva matters, does not address this particular issue. And I won't discuss it in itself, but it doesn't address that key issue. So target 14, what we want to get rid of. There is some very dangerous language in there, like recognize biodiversity as a strategic asset for the economy. What is going on at the moment across the CBD is this attempt to reduce biodiversity basically to an economic issue and to say what are its values. And finally, we'll have natural asset companies set up on the New York Stock Exchange, buying and selling ecosystem services if we're not careful. So we need all this language. We need to watch the language like offsetting net zero and so on. Strategic environmental assessments. This system of environmental and economic accounting also does the same thing. And I think a particularly strange addition to target 14, which still seems to be in the list, is deep sea mining. And I think one of the reasons why that's there is, for example, that the EU is having a big internal battle on that. But certainly the Alliance and EcoNexus feel that deep sea mining should not be mentioned in this target. So business, well, strict liability, legal responsibility and accountability of business need to be emphasized. They are not there in target 15 at all. We also have to be careful of the phrase due diligence, which just means that a company can say, oh, I didn't know, therefore I'm not responsible. And I do think that some of the fundamental things in the CBD and in the Rio principles needs to be applied. Precautionary approach, polluter pays principle. And I know this is really tough for many governments, but we have to have national and international level regulation. And I think also that the developed countries really need to take a better attitude on this whole thing about regulation and the impacts of corporations on the global south. just an extraordinary piece of text, reducing biodiversity-related risks to businesses and financial institutions, should be reversed, reducing business-related risks to biodiversity. And we have to eliminate negative impacts, not just reduce them. This is urgent. And it's not just accepting responsibility for their actions, which doesn't have any meaning, but to be held responsible for their actions. You see, the trouble is that much of the business language throughout the GBF and the CBD in recent years is very tame and very encourage and persuade and so forth. So we must operate within planetary boundaries. We need to address conflicts of interest. I think that this is vital at the moment, and it needs to apply across the GBF and the CBD. We've begun by applying it to ad hoc technical expert groups. But obviously, many businesses have major conflicts of interest, and we have to monitor all the processes and activities. This is a very demanding process, obviously, but it's also very necessary. We need full transparency. Respect for human rights is vital and fundamental. Business often has major impacts at a huge distance from where consumption takes place. So production and consumption may be very far from each other, and therefore it's hard for the consumers, unless they're properly informed, to see what's happening. And I think that some of the text of the CBD needs to be emphasized in all this. We need cross-border responsibilities, especially between developed countries and developing countries. So we need to look at paragraphs 3 and 4b of the convention and several others. There are other targets, other texts besides Article 20. So we must get rid of business self-responsibility. Sustainability of extraction is not good enough. We must reduce it now. And interesting, just to go back to the previous point, several countries have stated that they believe that the CBD should be subordinate to WTO agreements or others. And we say, no, this can't be, because biodiversity supports all life, and therefore we must make it fundamental to all our needs and all our work. I mentioned the word encourage. We need more to be applied to business than merely encouraging. And financial institutions we haven't paid enough attention to yet. Biodiversity positive practice is a nice little phrase, but what the hell does it mean? Excuse me. Target 16. Yes, people need regulatory support. But above all, people at the consumption end of the chain in rich countries, they need to be aware of the impacts on distant producers of their choices. But it's very hard for them at the moment. And governments also need to act to reject and remove damaging products from their markets, but that is also very hard. So we need the regulatory frameworks, and we need to reflect the impacts on biodiversity. And states also need to look at the processes of waste as well as consumption, and the principles of avoid, reuse, and recycle. And above all, perhaps we have to have equity and justice to avoid negative impacts on the poor by developed countries on developing countries and so on, and especially IPLCs. So where relevant, shouldn't be applied to overconsumption. Overconsumption is a major problem. Cultural preferences, we'd have to be very careful about that, and it mustn't be used to enable excessive consumption. These targets are absolutely vital, and they really, if they're not properly dealt with, they could undermine the effectiveness of the rest of the GBF. I believe this very strongly, but not enough attention is really being paid to them so far. And the texts, as discussed in Geneva, show the ongoing big divisions between people. And here is just a list for you to look at as a final slide of some of the organizations that have been involved in the discussion on mainstreaming and who are behind all this other discussion. So there we are. That's just a few of them, and it doesn't include all the financial institutions. So these are formidable. They have helped to write the mainstreaming the long-term approach to mainstreaming and also the targets. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Helena, for taking us through those very crucial targets 14 to 16. Colleagues, I know we are at the end of the time, but I will still love to open for questions and comments on this item. Johnson Ekpere, I see you've added questions already. So please, I would love to invite you to ask the floor. And as Johnson is asking if there's anyone, because this is the last round of hands I'm taking, please put your comments or put your hand up. Johnson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I will only ask one question. The others I think I have on the chat. I wanted somebody to speak to the professional technical competence.
We are losing you. You have frozen, unfortunately. If possible, please maybe close your video. Okay. I've seen a request in the chat to send the presentations. I'll definitely do that for everyone who registered. We have your email address. I've already sent 2 of those presentations in the chat box, the one on resource mobilization and the one on DSI, and I will add others. Johnson, checking if you are back online.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
Please consider
Good.
closing the video so that your line is better. Thanks.
Thank you. I wanted somebody to speak to the issue of the current level of technical professional competence in the scientific area of genomics and DSI in the context of ABS.
Thank you so much for that. I do believe that you had started responding on that in the chat box, Lactitia. So I'll refer the colleague there because I've already given a lot of time on that item. So please refer to the chat box and you can add if there's any pending questions. I see your hand is up, Pierre. Is it related to businesses? If yes, you can take the floor.
No, I wanted to answer Prof. Perry's question, but I have answered it in the chat box a little bit, so I'll save time and not take the floor now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. There was a question from Johnson directed to you, actually, Helena. I don't know if you saw it. It was saying what to remove from 14, very good, but how do you deal with big influence of businesses? So I'll give that question to you before we wrap up.
Yes, thank you very much. This is an extremely challenging issue. I've been working on the issue of business for a long time. Corporate structures and the illegal structure of the corporation from very early on is a major barrier that we have. It's very, very difficult to make companies responsible when they can create shell companies and so on. What I would say, and this would be probably completely impossible, is to say that we need to look at the powers of business and we need to decide what needs to be limited. We might even need to decide about the structure of the corporation with the lack of responsibility of shareholders for the impacts of the companies that they benefit from. There are many, many issues that need to be addressed. And the fact that many corporations are far more powerful and have much more clout than many countries, and that their supply lines are hugely long and that they work with each other, and that they are very secretive and that they are not obliged to disclose much of their information is a major problem. For example, Total has said, we are not responsible for anything we do in the Democratic Republic of Congo because these are shell companies or these are other companies. And this giving away of responsibility is something we need to tackle. Now, this is something we can't possibly tackle in the short term, but we must be aware of it. It's like the fact that companies can bring cases against countries for not allowing them to exploit their resources. Things like this really need to be looked at, and we are not looking at it strongly enough at the moment. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for joining us. We have reached the end of the webinar. I must say 2 hours is never enough to cover these issues, but fortunately, within 2 hours, we've been able to cover 8 issues actually that are currently under discussion. We've managed to cover Target 3 on area-based conservation, Target 5 on sustainable use, 14 on mainstreaming, 15 on business engagement, 16 on overconsumption, 18 on harmful subsidies, 19 on resource mobilization, and lastly but not least, we also covered DSI. So thanks for staying with us throughout. We hope you found it informative, and I would really love to emphasize for us at the CSOs Alliance, when we put this together, it was to ensure that especially CSO representatives, as they go to Nairobi, they understand that the issues, are well prepared and are well equipped to defend the African position or make the African position and other positions and so on. So we are looking forward to engaging with you further. Should you have any questions to the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance, or recommend that we do another session for the other target, I've put my email address on the chat box, and you are more than welcome to write to us, and we see how we engage further. The recording will be made available as promised. The presentations will also be shared with you via email since you registered, and you are encouraged to follow the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance in our social media updates so that you keep up to date with such events that we are putting, and also stay close to our website so that you can download some of the materials that we produce. So on my side, thank you so much, and have a great day, evening ahead, depending on where you are. Bye, colleagues, and thank you so much to our speakers. Bye.